There's something different about people who grew up in the 2000s. You see them navigating technology with effortless fluency while still getting misty-eyed over a flip phone. You notice how they can spot a curated persona from miles away, how they carry a strange patience that doesn't match their digital fluency, how they seem to straddle two completely different worlds with an almost contradictory ease. Maybe it's because they remember dial-up internet and the screech of a modem connecting. Maybe it's the way they experienced childhood before smartphones but came of age alongside them. Or maybe it's that peculiar mix of optimism and skepticism that seems almost impossible in today's hyper-polarized world. Because growing up in the 2000s didn't just shape their preferences or their nostalgia, it forged a specific type of psychological architecture that neither the generation before them nor the generation after them will ever fully understand. And by the end of this video, you're going to see why that decade created something genuinely unique. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong. When we think about people who grew up in the 2000s, we assume they're just younger millennials. We assume they had the same experiences as 90s kids, just with better graphics. We assume they're digital natives in exactly the same way Gen Z is digital native. More technology exposure equals the same technological relationship. More internet access equals the same internet brain. But people who grew up in the 2000s, they prove that theory dead wrong. Most assume these people are simply nostalgic for trends and music. Others think they're caught in some generational no man's land, belonging nowhere. Some even believe they're just millennials who want to feel special. But psychology tells a completely different story. Research on transitional cohorts reveals something surprising. People who experienced major technological and cultural shifts during their formative years often score higher on cognitive flexibility, adaptive resilience, and what researchers call temporal bilingualism, the ability to function fluently in two different cultural operating systems. They're not confused about their identity. They're not stuck between worlds. They've simply developed the rare ability to translate between eras, to hold multiple frameworks simultaneously, and to detect authenticity with unusual precision. And what they understand about adaptation, patience, and genuine connection might just change how you see the digital age forever.
Picture this scene. You're 8 years old. It's a Saturday morning in 2003. The sun is streaming through your bedroom window, and there's no notification pulling you anywhere. No group chat demanding attention. No algorithm deciding what you'll see first. You're watching cartoons on an actual television set with actual commercials you can't skip. Your plans for the day exist only in your head or written on a piece of paper stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. If you want to hang out with your friend across the neighborhood, you either call their house phone and hope they answer, or you just show up at their door. No tracking, no texting, no constant updates. You ride your bike to the park and you're genuinely unreachable for hours. Your parents know approximately where you are, and somehow everyone is okay with this arrangement. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't dangerous parenting by today's standards. It was the final breath of childhood as it had existed for generations. Here's the thing. Developmental psychologists have identified something called unstructured autonomous time as critical for building self-regulation, creativity, and internal motivation. Children who experience significant periods of unsupervised, self-directed play develop stronger executive function and emotional resilience. People who grew up in the 2000s caught the very end of this. They were the last cohort to experience childhood with significant offline autonomy before the smartphone revolution changed parenting forever. Their brains had years of development in low-stimulation, self-directed environments before the dopamine economy arrived. Compare this to children growing up today, where the average age for first smartphone ownership has dropped to 10, where going outside to play often requires coordination across 3 different apps, where boredom, that crucial psychological state that drives creativity, has been engineered away. Those years of analog childhood didn't just give them nostalgic memories, they gave them a neurological foundation that's becoming increasingly rare. Now, imagine you're 12. It's 2005, and everything is starting to shift. Your family just got high-speed internet. No more waiting 3 minutes for a single web page to load. No more getting kicked offline when someone picks up the phone. The world just got faster, and you're young enough to ride the acceleration without whiplash. You're watching your older siblings or cousins struggle to adapt to technology that feels intuitive to you. You're watching your younger relatives who won't remember anything different, and you're sitting right in the middle, fully conscious of the change happening in real time. You remember before, you're fluent in after, and you're aware that you're living through a hinge point in human history. But here's what's fascinating. This awareness, this metacognition about technological change, created something researchers now call adaptive flexibility. When you consciously experience a transition rather than being born into the new reality, your brain develops different mapping systems. You don't just learn new tools, you learn how to learn new tools. You don't just adapt to change, you develop a template for adaptation itself. People who grew up in the 2000s experienced the most rapid technological transformation in human history during their most neuroplastic years. They went from VHS tapes to streaming, from disposable cameras to camera phones, from MapQuest printouts to GPS, from passing notes in class to instant messaging, all while their prefrontal cortex was still forming its final architecture. This wasn't overwhelming. This wasn't disorienting. It was training. Their brains learned to expect change, to anticipate evolution, to hold current systems loosely because something new was always coming. That's not instability. That's not rootlessness. That's cognitive resilience built through lived experience.
Let's talk about something most people overlook. These were the guinea pigs of social media. You're 14. It's 2006. You've just created your first MySpace profile. You're choosing your top 8 friends, agonizing over the order because everyone can see it. You're customizing your page with HTML code you learned from a tutorial website, adding glittery graphics and an auto-playing song that defines your entire personality this month. This is social media before anyone knew what social media would become. There's no influencer economy yet, no algorithm pushing content at you, no parents monitoring your activity because they barely understand what you're doing. You're figuring out digital identity in real time, making mistakes that won't follow you forever because nothing is quite permanent yet. Learning the social dynamics of online spaces before the rules were written. And you know what happened? You developed something invaluable. You learned to craft identity consciously. You understood at a visceral level that online presentation was a construction because you literally constructed it yourself, choosing every element deliberately. You couldn't mistake it for reality because you watched yourself build it. Psychologists who study social media's impact on adolescent development have identified a crucial variable: awareness of curation. Those who understand that online personas are performed, who develop this understanding through active participation rather than passive consumption, show significantly lower rates of social comparison anxiety. People who grew up building MySpace pages, carefully selecting their AIM away messages, crafting their early Facebook profiles when it was still for college students, they were the experimental group. They learned the game by playing it consciously. Compare this to children now who receive curated content from sophisticated algorithms before they can walk, who absorb idealized imagery without the conscious experience of creating it themselves, who never saw the seams of digital identity construction. That 2000s cohort learned something that became invisible to later generations. This is all made up. Fast forward to 2008. You're in high school, maybe early college, and the world is falling apart. You're watching your parents' faces when they check the news. You're hearing conversations about mortgages and layoffs and retirement accounts that have lost half their value. Maybe your family is directly affected. Maybe you're watching friends' families lose homes. Maybe you're just absorbing the ambient terror of adults who thought they understood the rules, discovering that the rules could change overnight. This wasn't an abstraction you read about later. You lived through it during your identity formation years. Here's what most people miss. Researchers have found that economic anxiety experienced during adolescence creates lasting psychological patterns, but not always in the ways we'd expect. Those who witnessed economic collapse during formative years often develop what psychologists call protective skepticism, a hesitancy to trust institutional promises that, paradoxically, can make them more resilient to future disappointments. People who grew up in the 2000s entered adulthood with their expectations already adjusted. They didn't expect the career trajectories their parents had. They didn't assume home ownership would be automatic. They weren't shocked when the economy proved unstable again. This wasn't pessimism. This wasn't learned helplessness. It was realistic calibration. And while this generation gets criticized for killing various industries or delaying traditional milestones, the psychology reveals something different. They're not failing to achieve the American dream. They watched the American dream glitch in real time and adjusted their operating system accordingly. That's not brokenness, that's adaptation. Then there's the question of what these individuals carry that they rarely talk about directly. You're 6 years old. It's September 11th, 2001, and something is happening that the adults can't hide from you. Maybe you remember watching the footage. Maybe you remember the silence in your classroom. Maybe you just remember the feeling, the sudden understanding that the world contained dangers you couldn't comprehend, that adults didn't have control, that nowhere was guaranteed safe. You grew up in the shadow of this. Color-coded terror alerts became background noise. Taking off your shoes at the airport was just what you did. The word terrorism entered your vocabulary before you understood what it meant. And then there were other shadows. School shootings that became more frequent as you got older, code red drills that weren't just fire drills anymore, the slow normalization of looking for exits, of scanning crowds, of carrying a low-grade awareness that any place could become dangerous. Think about that for a moment. This generation was the first to grow up with active shooter drills as routine. They were children processing national trauma before they had the cognitive tools to process it fully. And they did this largely without the language or framework we now have for discussing collective trauma. Psychologists studying generational trauma patterns have noted that children who experience collective trauma during development often internalize it differently than adults. They don't have a before to compare to. The anxiety becomes atmospheric, present but unnamed, shaping perception without conscious awareness. People who grew up in the 2000s carry this, not always as conscious memories, but as a certain vigilance, a certain skepticism about safety, a certain dark humor that emerged to cope with absurdity. This wasn't damage, this wasn't dysfunction, it was survival adaptation. It was learning to live with uncertainty as a permanent condition.
Now, let's address something deeper. Where exactly do these people belong? Too young to be true millennials, too old to be Gen Z, caught in a demographic gap that doesn't quite have a name. You share childhood touchstones with neither group entirely. The millennials were already in high school when you were discovering SpongeBob. Gen Z doesn't remember a time before YouTube existed. And here's the paradox. This in-between status, which might seem like a disadvantage, created something valuable. When you don't fully belong to a generational identity, you're forced to construct identity from other materials. You can't simply adopt the pre-made package, the assumed traits, the collective narrative, the cultural shorthand. You have to build something more individually. Developmental psychology recognizes that identity formation is strongest when it involves active exploration rather than passive adoption. Those who question group membership, who don't fit neatly into categories, who must consciously choose their affiliations, they often develop more nuanced, more flexible, more personally authentic identities. People who grew up in the 2000s couldn't coast on generational identity. They had to actually figure out who they were. And this extends beyond generation. They experienced identity before everything was online and after. They constructed selves across multiple platforms as those platforms emerged and died. They had to learn, repeatedly, that identity was ongoing negotiation rather than fixed destination. That's not confusion. That's not rootlessness. That's psychological sophistication. There's another layer to this. Consider what it actually meant to use technology in the early 2000s. You want to download a song, one song. It takes 45 minutes. You watch the progress bar inch forward. You hope no one picks up the phone. You wait. You want to see a video online. It buffers and buffers and buffers. You watch 10 seconds, wait 30 seconds, watch 10 more. You learn patience or you learn frustration, usually both. You want to play a video game. The disc is scratched. It freezes at the loading screen. You take it out, breathe on it, wipe it with your shirt, pray to whatever gods might listen to a 12-year-old with a PlayStation 2. Let that sink in. This generation learned waiting as an embedded feature of technology, not a bug. They developed tolerance for delayed gratification that was literally programmed into their entertainment. Researchers studying the psychology of instant gratification have found that impulse control is significantly influenced by early environmental expectations. Children who learn that waiting is simply part of how things work develop stronger self-regulation than those who experience primarily instant fulfillment. Compare this to today's technology, where anything slower than 2 seconds feels broken, where entire user experiences are optimized to eliminate any friction whatsoever, where the capacity to wait is never exercised because nothing requires it. People who grew up in the 2000s developed patience as a side effect of technological limitation. They didn't know they were building psychological muscle. They just knew that if they wanted to hear that Fall Out Boy album, they were going to sit there and watch that download bar for an hour. That patience didn't disappear when the technology improved. It became a resource. But the psychology goes even further. These people developed something essential for navigating the modern world, a finely tuned authenticity detector. You were there for the early influencer era. You watched normal people become internet famous. You saw the construction happen in real time, the persona building, the brand deals, the slow transformation of friends into content creators. You weren't born into a world where influencer culture was already normalized. You witnessed its emergence. You saw the transition from genuine sharing to strategic posting. You know what internet culture looked like before everything was monetized. Here's what researchers discovered. First-hand exposure to the evolution of a cultural phenomenon creates stronger critical analysis than exposure to its completed form. Those who watched social media transform from tool to industry understand its mechanics differently than those who inherited it as a finished product. People who grew up in the 2000s can often identify performative behavior faster. They know what genuine internet interaction looked like because they experienced it. They remember when sharing something wasn't always strategic. They can sense the difference between authentic expression and optimized content, even when that difference has become almost invisible to those who never knew anything else. This wasn't cynicism they developed, it was discernment. In a world increasingly saturated with curated presentation, they carry internal reference points for what unscripted reality actually looked like.
So what does all this add up to? People who grew up in the 2000s aren't a lost generation. They aren't generationally homeless. They aren't defined by their technology consumption or their participation trophies or whatever reductive narrative gets assigned to them. They're something else entirely. They're translators. They speak fluent analog and fluent digital. They can connect with older generations who remember rotary phones and younger generations who've never known a world without smartphones. They bridge eras in ways that seem natural because translation was their native environment. They're the skeptics with hope. They watched institutions fail and systems crash and dreams get downgraded, and they're still here, still trying, still building. Not because they're naive enough to trust, but because they're resilient enough to persist without trust. They're the last ones who remember. They know what boredom felt like before it was filled with infinite content. They know what communication looked like before read receipts. They know what social life was before it was performance. And that memory gives them something irreplaceable, a reference point, a point of comparison, a reminder that things can be different because things were different. These individuals carry within them something that's becoming increasingly rare in our constantly connected, algorithmically curated, performatively optimized world. A patience that was learned through technological friction, an authenticity detector that was calibrated through watching the construction of online personas from the ground floor, a cognitive flexibility that was built through adapting to the fastest technological change in human history, and a resilience that was forged through economic collapse, collective trauma, and growing up in the shadow of events that reshaped the world. Their minds were literally shaped by transition, strengthened by waiting, calibrated by authenticity, and refined by uncertainty. They're living proof that timing matters, that when you grow up determines not just what you experience, but how you process everything afterward. That straddling two worlds doesn't make you rootless, it makes you bilingual. That maybe, just maybe, the awkward position of being between defined generations isn't a disadvantage, it's a vantage point. In a world of instant gratification and curated reality and generational warfare, they stand as evidence of another way. Not a perfect generation, not a generation without their own struggles and blind spots, but a generation uniquely equipped to navigate the chaos of the present because they've already lived through so much transition. They learned to wait before everything was instant. They learned to detect performance before everything was performed. They learned to adapt before adaptation was optional. And they learned to persist through uncertainty before uncertainty became constant. That's not confusion. That's not displacement. That's perspective. That's resilience. That's wisdom. And that's exactly what the world needs right now. Drop a comment below and share your experience growing up in the 2000s. What do you carry from that decade that you think shaped who you are? And if this resonated with you, hit like and subscribe because we dive deep into the psychology that actually explains how your mind works. See you next time.